Good morning, everybody, and welcome to NJPAC's virtual Business Partners Roundtable at Home. It's a series of virtual conversations featuring business executives, government leaders, and others from throughout our state, speaking on the issues that we care about most. We're grateful that so many of you have chosen to join us this morning. These business partner roundtables have been popular events at NJPAC for many, many years, and now with our campus closed, we've recreated them in an online setting, and we've opened up these opportunities to hear from New Jersey's thought leaders to our members and many members of our sister Newark and greater Newark organizations as well. I want to thank our series sponsor, PNC Bank, and our energetic and creative business partners committee chair, Joel Sherman of Atlantic Tomorrow's office, for making these events possible. I'm really looking forward to the conversation you're about to hear between Barry Ostrowski, President and Chief Executive Officer of RWJBarnabas Health, and his colleague, Micheline Davis, the company's Executive Vice President and Chief Corporate Affairs Officer. They've shared their vision of how corporate entities can become change agents in a just published book, Changing Missions, Changing Lives, and that book will be the context for our conversation today. I will remind everybody that this book is available wherever you buy books. The easiest way I have found to buy this book is simply clicking on Amazon, and there you go. You'll have it in a couple of days. It's wonderful. We are very pleased that Marsha Wilson Brown, Vice Chancellor for External and Governmental Relations at Rutgers Newark, and the President of Women in NJPAC will lead this morning's conversation with Barry and Micheline. Just to remind you of our timing this morning, this is about a 45-minute session, half an hour or so moderated Q&A with Marsha and our panelists, followed by 15 minutes of questions from you. If you'd like to ask our panelists a question, you can do it at any time by typing it into the Q&A box, and you can find the Q&A box when you hover your cursor at the bottom of your Zoom screen. So you're about to spend some time with three extraordinary change makers, people who believe it's embedded in their day job to make the world a better place by encouraging excellence, diversity, inclusion, and a sense of ownership among their colleagues and in their community. Marsha has done so in her role as an inspiring educator and an active civic leader, and Barry and Micheline, leaders of the state's largest network of healthcare providers, have been intentional and successful, not only in the extraordinary services that RWJBarnabas provides, but also giving every Barnabas team member a sense of future and possibilities. Running a successful healthcare business or being a leader at a unique higher ed institution, that's one thing. Succeeding in that work and also making a desire to change the world for the better, part and parcel of the enterprise, that's a kind of leadership I think all of us aspire to. The fact that Micheline is a trustee of Women at NJPAC, that Marsha is president of Women at NJPAC, and that Barry is the co-chair of NJPAC's board makes us the luckiest arts center in America. I thank all three of you for being part of our family. And now, Marsha Brown, the floor is yours. Have a good time.
Thank you, John. Good morning and welcome to Business Partners Roundtable Online, sponsored by the New Jersey Performing Arts Center and Women at NJPAC right here in the great city of Newark, New Jersey. I'm delighted to moderate today's panel of guests because they happen to be two of my favorite people, Barry Ostrowski and Micheline Davis of RWJBarnabas Health. Now, John has already introduced them in a masterful way, but for the record, Barry and Micheline really are senior leaders at the top of the C-suite. Barry as president and CEO, and Micheline as executive vice president and chief corporate affairs office. And they are not only my comrades here at New Jersey PAC, but they are two of my most important co-conspirators in this journey of enlightenment that we have always agreed that we are on. And enlightenment is the key word for today's show, because we are here to both celebrate and to dive into their recently published book, Changing Missions, Changing Lives. Great look. A book which has been described as dispensing practical and actionable insights on how companies can become change agents and a force for good. So good morning, Barry, Micheline, and welcome to BPR Online.
Good morning,
Good to see
Marcia.
you. It's good to see you without mask.
Hi.
So let's get right into it, because there are a lot of questions for you all, and I want to try to get to as many as possible. So this first question is to both of you all. The title of your book, Changing Missions, Changing Lives. Who is this book for, and who will it impact the most?
Well, at the risk of age going before beauty, let me start. First of all, thank you, Marcia, for doing this and your kind words, and before you, John, for your more than benevolent introduction. We wrote this book because we really want the greatest impact to be on the people of our communities. The question is, who can actually instigate that impact? And that impact, we think, is a responsibility of all those who manage companies, and frankly, all those who are involved in working in big organizations. Unfortunately, and somewhat regrettably, not-for-profit healthcare organizations historically have concentrated exclusively on clinical programs. And what we know is clinical programs will not ensure the best health of those who live in our communities. And so this book is an attempt to convince all those who have certain levels of leadership responsibility over organizations to look beyond the core business that you may be currently running, and ensure that you allocate resources and create programs and engage in the community. Because if you mean to help the community, if you mean to have healthier people in your communities, you can't, in the case of healthcare, rely exclusively on clinical services. You have to do things like build housing. You have to invest in food insecurity. You have to ensure safer streets. So we're hoping that our colleagues that run healthcare institutions will understand that which we've written here and begin to move their organizations to a mission that includes and emphasizes social programs, not exclusively clinical programs.
Thank you, Barry. Micheline, you want to tackle that question as well?
I think that Barry has really enunciated extremely clearly. Truth be told, one of the things that we wanted to ensure was that we were really welcoming into the field others who looked around their current institutions and their society and decided that there was something that could be better. And then provide for them, quite frankly, a blueprint on how we attempted to do exactly that, how we attempted to become a part of the change that we wanted to see in the world, and how institutions, large and small, can be a part of that. So we attempt to lay out that blueprint and really provide that roadmap, warts and all.
Thank you, Micheline. Now, Barry, you say if the companies mean to help, go beyond the clinical to social programs, and it sounds like this has a personal edge to it. So I know you give us more of a personal lens into a childhood that influenced your values, both as a person and as a corporate leader. So talk a little bit about those childhood experiences and how they led you to have more of a racial equity lens in the work that you do every day.
Thank you, Marcia. All that is true, frankly. I grew up in a household where we were taught about persecution for other reasons. And it was made clear to us as children that everyone had to be treated with respect, and not just equality. Although the word equity at that time was not used, it was made clear to us that certain people needed additional help in order to have a fair opportunity to live the lives that they deserve. And I saw this firsthand. We put this in the book. I grew up in a family paint store business. And back then, frankly, the painting industry was dominated by white painters. Black painters had a very difficult time starting their own businesses, had a very difficult time getting credit from the paint store, so they couldn't really go out on their own. And I was proud to say my father was among the first to give credit to Black painters. And I saw how that actually allowed Black painters to start their own businesses. And quite ironically, coincidentally, there was a time at that point where contractors who were building significant buildings had to have a certain percentage of minority contractors help them. And one of those Black painters was given the opportunity to bid on a big building. And I went with my father and that Black painter. We walked the building, we went back to our little store, we figured out how much paint was necessary, and this Black painter got the job, which allowed him to grow his business. And so I lived it and I saw this, and it made an incredible impression. I have to tell you that that very building is the building in which I now have my office, completely ironically. In fact, back then it belonged to a predecessor of PNC, which was National Bank of Essex. And so if you live it, if you see it, if you see that it works, I think it makes an indelible impact on what you should be doing with your life. And that has clearly influenced me in my professional career.
Thank you, Barry, for sharing that, and also for giving us that charge. You know, I remember in the 60s, we used to say the personal is political. So I think that, you know, your experience, what you've shared with us affirms that. Let me shift gears just a little bit. In chapters 1 and 2, you and Micheline make the case to your board using data, using investigative studies, you bring in external allies, and you make the pitch. So, I mean, from my world, you know, that sounds kind of academic. And although you guys are not professors, talk a little bit about how that made a difference to your board in approaching it that way. And you say they overwhelmingly accepted that pitch. That's a wonderful thing. But what kind of resistance did you experience?
Well, I have to say it was overwhelmingly embraced. So when Micheline and I got together to start this journey, obviously we had to go to the board to get its concurrence, because the impact on the organization of doing this was to in fact make financial investments on which there would be no financial payback within any reasonable period of time from a business perspective. And so Micheline gathered encyclopedic data and information that proved beyond any shadow of a doubt that the health of our communities was more impacted by social determinants than they were clinical programs. And we felt we had to have this body of information in order to persuade the board that it was worth their involvement in permitting us to make these investments and launch these programs. So he walked in as a lawyer would prepare for a case and find himself or herself in front of a very friendly jury. We were prepared to go through all this, and our board said to us, we understand. That's why we're volunteer trustees of a healthcare organization. If you're saying this is what it's going to take to make the communities healthier, we're with you. I would just drop a footnote. That information and data has been around for decades. So it wasn't anything brand new. It unfortunately hadn't been taken, if you will, from the laboratory to the bedside, from the academic environment to the ground where we have to do it. And I sadly would say to you, it took longer and it took a great deal more persuasive advocacy to convince many of our colleagues who worked in the organization as to the rightfulness of doing this than it did the voluntary trustees. And there's a whole story, of course, behind that. But I'll tell you that Micheline's work in gathering this, and of course, we all know of her ability to persuade all of us to do the right thing, was really what got us to execute on this in a meaningful way in a very short period of time with the uniform and unanimous support of our board.
Thank you, Barry. Yes, we all know how ferocious Micheline can be. And our audience may not know that both of you all are lawyers. So I'm not surprised that you came in before the board and you had all your dockets in order, you know. So thank you for sharing that. And yeah, I want to go back to Micheline too, because the book discusses with a lot of power these systemic issues, that point to policies which have inadvertently and also intentionally harmed certain segments of the population. And those are the reasons why we have health inequity and racial wealth gaps and inequality in education and achievement gaps, and you name it. So Micheline, talk about what compelled you to not only write about this, I know why, but tell our audience why you were audacious enough to tackle these systemic issues.
Thank you, Marcia. It's such a good question. So much of what we have seen across the country has really been a variety of both nonprofit and even here and there some for-profit institutions attempting to address the social determinants of health. Those factors that contribute to the outcomes of health that are actually outside of the clinical space, right? So outside of your time in your physician's office, but quite frankly have an incredibly impactful result on your health outcomes. The issue is that oftentimes they have been initiatives or efforts that really just get to whether or not you have enough food for today. They have not been those types of efforts that, as we have seen, really are the ones that communities need. They need to figure out two things. One, how it is that we wind up growing up, living in environments that are both food deserts, right? Meaning that there isn't ample access to affordable, nutritious food. And food swamps, meaning that there's an oversaturation of entities that serve deep fried and high saturated fat foods and high sugar content foods, high salt foods. Well, the issue there is that we don't need to merely do one particular project through a community benefit lens. We realized that we really had to go way upstream. It's Bishop Tutu who said it is not enough to simply pour people out of the river. You must go upstream in order to figure out why it is that they are falling in. And so our effort was really a policy-led health equity framework in order to do so. So why in the world would we attempt to do it? Well, Barry just explained that he realized as a very young boy through his up close and personal interaction under the guidance of his father with local minority-owned businesses, and that there was actually a system in place that prevented them from obtaining the same access and opportunity as many of their white counterparts. Well, you know me, Marcia, right? You know that, yes, in fact, I come from a background of being a trial litigator, so Barry's absolutely right. I chuckled as he answered your last question, because we walked in there with trial notebooks. But also because of the fact that while I sit in this opportunity now, I am from a little known place called Camden, New Jersey. And what I firmly understood was that as I looked around, that there were so many decisions that were happening outside of the purview of the individuals who literally were living at the point of the pain, right? But were kept out of the power of being able to render decisions around what would or would not appear in their local environment, right? Whether or not the town incinerator and, right, other local environmental pollutants would be in that community. I look back on literally, as we both did, well, what contributed to the current environment. And what we understood was that these were systemic and structural issues. No one wakes up early in the morning and decides that they want to have a higher incident rate of asthma or a higher mortality rate of cancer than other communities. It really has been as a result of the systemic and structural barriers that have been put in place, everything from redlining, my friend, to environmental injustice, zoning laws, etc. And what we realized was that we could not attempt to address the social determinants of health without literally going through a lens which viewed the impact and effect of those long-term structural and systemic issues.
Marcia, if I might, I would just like to elaborate, because Micheline's modest on this topic at least. We talk about food insecurity. We at Newark Beth built a greenhouse. We developed foods, and we wanted to make those foods available to the community. And the first thing we found out is that a particular governmental program prohibited these members of the community from acquiring this food using the subsidies granted to them in the program. And so here we were trying to do the right thing, and we immediately bumped into a legislated policy that made it impossible to bring the food to those who needed it most. And as Micheline points out, we undertook this in the policy realm in our organization. We asked the people in the policy area to be part of this and frankly to lead it. And so we were able to go and get that policy changed. But that was to everyone a clear indication that there are already legislated, already regulatory established obstacles to doing what we have to do to help people. Unfortunately, I say and emphasize, there are many such policies and many such regulations, whether they're overt or subtle, they in fact are there. And what they do is they tend to perpetualize the lives of people who tend to suffer. And so it's great to have good programs, and it's certainly wonderful to be on the right mission. But if you're not willing to take on these previously legislated policies and regulations that effectively reduce what it is you're trying to accomplish, you really won't accomplish as much as you should.
Well, thank you, Barry and Micheline, because in your answers, you have answered another question, what have been the greatest opportunities and the greatest challenges as you've taken this journey, and certainly facing policies outside of your own organizational ability to address is one of those. And so you're actually saying to companies who are interested in being a force for good that you also have to think about ways in which you may have to externally go outward in order to accomplish what it is that you're looking to do as a company internally. So that leads me to another question, because clearly, Micheline had your support, you had the board support. Talk a little bit about how your teams have embraced equity as a value.
Well, as I might have alluded to earlier, it seemed more apparent to the board than it did some of our own colleagues. And to give everyone the benefit of the doubt, particularly in healthcare, folks have been trained to do very certain things in a very certain way, to concentrate on conventional clinical programs, to organize themselves in a variety of ways that address simply conventional programming. When Micheline and I went to our colleagues and said, we're not going to make our communities healthier simply by having great clinical programs, we need to have a platform of social programs, it was a foreign notion to many of our colleagues. They weren't trained like that. Social programs sounded to some of our more clinically trained people as a little bit of voodoo medicine. Is that really, we're talking about real doctors and real programs, and you're telling us about food insecurity, and you're telling us about the, so I don't think it was about wanting to deny it. I think it took an awful long time to process it. And I am gratified that while it may have taken a little bit longer than we had wanted, it has in fact gotten the traction that we want. And so now people in our organization talk about making communities healthier, not just providing clinical services. And they talk about making communities healthier by addressing these social determinants. And so I think we have penetrated the body of our organization to do that. And just to add one piece, it affects the individuals in a lot of different ways, not the least of which is many of our colleagues come and say, I need capital for this clinical program. And we are effectively saying, you can't have all the capital that you want because some of that capital is going into social programs. And in an organization where capital allocation, for certainly our business colleagues who are listening in, where capital allocation is crucial, it has to be that capital allocation to these social programs is a very real, not casual commitment. And so people will, in fact, have to find a way to compromise that allocation between our core business, or at least what it used to be, of clinical services and our social programs. So I think we've made great progress. It didn't happen overnight by any means, And it's why I think this book is useful to those in an organization to read, to try to understand how they have to change their daily lives, whether at the C-suite level or not, in order to make a difference in the community.
Micheline, do you think that anything was missing in that approach, or talk a little bit about what conversations now look like in your space? Are they different? Is it just compassionate leadership? Is it just having a heart for what's right?
Thank you, Marsha. I will tell you, Barry was consistent and persistent in ensuring that we also spoke to the hearts and minds of individuals. What's interesting about that was that I was the one who was arguing, saying, I think that we have to make certain that they know that there's a business case to this, that there's a real business interest. He was adamant that no, people just want to do what's right. I think that's because he has clearly an optimistic lens as we view the world. But I will tell you this, it is a really interesting aspect to go into someone who is already flying at the speed of light, doing exactly what it is that they have always done in the way in which they have always done it, and quite frankly, been relatively successful based on what they've been measured by in order to effectuate institutional success and effectiveness. So coming to them and saying, what you've been doing thus far is great. We just want to pivot slightly in order to ensure that we're including a variety of other things is an interesting dialogue to have with anyone, let me tell you. As I look at the approach that we took, it was evidence-based and evidence researched, it was evidence-backed, it was really full of data, but also anecdotal evidence assuredly. When I look back at, so what perhaps was missing of the approach, to answer your question, Marsha, it's really interesting. One of the things that I say now as we look back is the fact that actually we went forward along with fantastic sister organizations like Rutgers Newark and others who are members of the Newark Anchor Collaborative in order to truly lean into and embrace our anchor mission in order to do this work. But when you apply a racial equity lens to an anchor mission, you realize that so much of your anchor mission can also be anti-racist work, right? And so the issue is, was that missing from the work? Well, I'll tell you this, I'm not certain that we would have gotten the amount of buy-in that we were effectively able to do if in fact that was said too early, right? And so now there are stages and phases that we're able to add to the work as it matures and as it evolves. You asked Barry the issue about equity and how it's embraced throughout the system. It's really important that we also mention that this is an early journey, right? And one of the reasons why we wanted to write the book now is because we wanted to make certain that folks knew that it's okay to enter the space even when you do not have all of the answers, right? What's not okay is remaining in a position of doing nothing. And so I can look back now in hindsight and trust me, I hit my head all the time, like, why didn't we include this at the time? But I think that's what's really keenly important is the opportunity to enter a learning practice cohort like we have at NAC in order to ensure that there's opportunity to continue learning, right? From one another, from best practices across the country and quite frankly across the globe, in order to continue to embed and involve the work so that it is most reflective of the needs of the communities which continually evolve themselves. So I'm happy to say that, right, I look back and certainly there are things that I wish that we would have done then. What's great is that we can still do them now.
Absolutely.
Now, Marsha,
Well,
if I can, to me, the most obvious thing we didn't address, because it's only been around for hundreds of years, is structural racism. So we looked at the social determinants, and we didn't discuss that by way of structural racism. We discussed it in the inequities of access to healthcare. Had we changed that focus, maybe we would have been further along on that journey. But the truth is, because we launched the social determinant journey, we're now, our commitment to dismantling racism, both in and outside of our organization, has a better platform for cultural change. So while it may have come later, because it too is as obvious as social determinants, of course, while it may have come later, it's now come while we've set a platform that requires us, not optionally, not discretionally, not as a discretionary commitment. It requires us to now address the dismantling of racism. And that journey, of course, is now more formally just beginning for us.
Absolutely. There are a lot of questions in the queue, so I'm going to wind down our interaction, but I do want to affirm that this is a period of deconstruction. And so Micheline is right. This is an evolutionary journey. It's a journey of 1,000 miles, but it's also a journey that has to take a collaborative table, as Nancy Cantor always says. So 2 questions. What did your work in this area do to your bottom line? You know, that's always a sort of a hardcore query, right? I mean, look, the bottom line is the company has to exist. You know, you've got shareholders. You know, you've got to make sure that, you know, you're on a course where your company is sustainable. So is it sustainable with the anti-racist and racial lens that you now have?
Well, so I think it has to be answered in phases. Clearly, when we took capital and invested in social determinant programming, it was capital that didn't go elsewhere, and it was capital on which we did not get a financial return. So it was not necessarily accretive to our bottom line for sure. But if you look at it from a more long-term business perspective, what it does do is it makes you an essential participant in your community. It, in fact, allows you to create the relationships which ultimately inure to your core business. If people trust you in our world, then people will use you for the services that you provide. And you build trust by being part of the community in a way that is, in fact, productive beyond the core business. Nancy Cantor is the world's expert, candidly, on the anchor institutional mission. And you can't be an anchor institutional mission if you just stick to the core business. So yes, it's a financial sacrifice, but I think as a long-term business strategy, it will in fact repay the organization that makes the commitment. Also, there's, I think, a misunderstanding about some of the social determinant programs. A lot of people have made a lot of money in the food business. A lot of people have made a lot of money in the housing business. So as we go into these businesses, we put up the capital. We obviously have to incur the startup costs, but at some point, we truly hope that there will be self-sustaining approaches to these programs that we've launched. And I think that's possible. Now, some will never have a financial payback, but others can. So it isn't immediately accretive to the bottom line, but in a long-term business perspective, it will, in fact, certainly in our view, make the company stronger.
Thank you, Barry. I applaud that view. I think Micheline wanted to jump in just for, did you want to jump in, Micheline?
Yes, Marcia, I'd love to add to that as well. I mean, as the truth is revealed through what Barry stated, there's also the impact of the fact that, right, we're doing this in order to literally ensure that future generations have a greater opportunity to grow up truly being healthy and well, that they all have, right, health equity opportunity in order to have long-term and long healthy lives. So when we look at that, what we know is that we can expect to see, perhaps not most immediately, not in this generation right now, but in future generations, as we carve out and impact the effects within their environments, the rate of violence, the issue of environmental injustice, right? Whether or not there's access to healthy, nutritious, affordable food, a variety of other structural barriers that we can help to undress. But also, as we look at internally, right? This is the hard lens. As we look at our own institutional policies, practices, and procedures and processes, and are able to identify how have we as large-scale corporations contributed to the proliferation of the disparities that we see in society, and what can we do to utilize your word, disrupt and dismantle those barriers, right? As we contribute to that, can we in fact begin to turn the corner, right, to turn the ship in order to ensure that we have greater equity in our seas? So as a result of that, we would expect to see in future less frequent flyers or familiar faces come through our most expensive door of our emergency room, right?
Mhm,
We would
mhm.
expect to see much better outcomes and less chronic disease, et cetera. And so truth be told, on a long range, long-term effect, we would expect to see better cost savings, right? Less expensive care at farther advanced stages of disease.
Well, as a Black woman growing up in America, whose aunties, uncles, grandparents probably have, I'm sure, were subject to the disparities that we're talking about today, I applaud the work that's going on right now in your company and the conversations that you're having. And I imagine that you guys are going to be light years ahead in terms of the work that you want to do in public health. And I thank you for that. Now, I've got to go to these questions. So let me start with the first one. How does the role of anchors differ related to smaller cities, given the varying depth of balance sheets, when improving SDOH, I guess you guys know what that means, to advance equity through issues such as affordable humane housing and affordable healthy food retail access? That was a long question, but did you guys get that? Do I
Yeah.
need to read it again? Okay.
No, I think it is one of the key questions. So how do companies of all sizes participate in addressing the social determinants of health, whether you have a fortress balance sheet or you have certainly one that's less strong? I think what's critical, and we try to make the point in the book, is we're a big organization and we're blessed to have a very strong balance sheet, but we couldn't do it alone. So as Micheline said earlier, we spoke to small community-based organizations who had already developed constituents that they helped. Unfortunately, these organizations live grant to grant and donation to donation, and we formed a partnership with them so that everyone could participate. You didn't have to have a big balance sheet. You didn't have to have a wide array of services. And so if you don't create that kind of partnership, and if you don't encourage smaller organizations, be they not-for-profit or for-profit, to participate, you're not going to be successful. And I have to tell you, I love it. We have at least quarterly meetings with 15 or 18 of these organizations. We talk about what they do. We offer to help in their mission. And they, in turn, of course, have become successful in helping us address these social determinants. So I don't think this idea is meant exclusively for big companies. This idea is meant for every level of organization that is willing to either modify its mission or adopt a mission to make the community better. And if you are so inclined, no matter what size you are or how difficult the financial straits are, you should be able to participate. You don't have to contribute the same that a big company contributes, but if you're at the table, if you're offering advice, if you're out there doing that, which I think can be done, this is open to everybody, and we certainly would encourage everyone to do it.
Amen. So this next question applauds your work and your capital investments. And then it asks, what are you doing about the psychological and mental health issues, which is a key driver? Good question.
Why? Micheline, do you want to start that?
Absolutely. I was like, it's good. It's a good question, and it's well timed. So as you know, in partnership with Rutgers and RVHS, we literally have one of the largest behavioral health networks, actually not just in the state, but indeed in the country. Barry is well aware that we just as we mentioned about the important element of also ensuring that we're addressing structural and systemic racism as an aspect of the approach that we wish we would have applied at the time. The truth is that our approach to SDOH, the social determinants of health, which we referenced earlier, is one that we can that is properly faced through a racial equity lens. That includes, quite frankly, the impact and effect of racial trauma. And so right now we are in the process of literally developing and standing up a racial trauma-informed behavioral health resource. First, quite frankly, we looked at it for our own employees. As a result of going through the height of the COVID pandemic, we really wanted to build up the resiliency of our employees through something called Connect Together. But as a result of the horrendous murder of George Floyd, and then indeed the rest of civil unrest that unveiled across the country, we began to realize as well that if I am feeling this heavy every day, then undoubtedly those within our system at positions that are less than on the hierarchical chart than an executive vice president undoubtedly are feeling them as well. And that if that is the truth, then it is the truth as well in our communities. And so we are in the midst of literally correcting that by virtue of creating this entire initiative. And we would be happy to be able to provide that to our patient public once it is actually completed. I will tell you this, Marcia, there is an aspect of the weathering of living in environments of the social determinants of health. You know, there was once an effort to remove social from that term. And the reason why I was one of the people who kind of fought it was because of the fact that when you acknowledge that it is the social determinants of health, we can acknowledge that it has been socially constructed, which means that we have the ability to socially deconstruct it. I also refer to it as the political determinants of health, because so much of what individuals in these communities are living under have really come about as a result of the political decisions that have been made. You know, we stand at a really unique opportunity because of the fact that and the book talks about our love of doing this and launching this in Barry's birth town of Newark, New Jersey, right? He grew up there for some time, went to Maple Avenue School. It is his heart's town. But truth be told, anyone who's come close to Newark, you would understand why your heart becomes infatuated with it as well. We have fantastic leadership in Mayor Ras Baraka, but we also have a mayor whose father was the voice of the rebellion. And so really being able to witness firsthand what it was like in order to truly understand how these issues of structural and systemic barriers and quite frankly, decisions that get made truly have an effect and an impact on that community is something that I believe that the Newark Rebellion showed us way before we were where we are today. I know, Marcia, you had a first-hand front row seat at witnessing all of that and being a leader that helped to lead the community back from that. So we thank you for that as well.
Well, don't even bring me up because, you know, I'm still hiding out. But listen, so given that enlightened view, how are we, or how's RWJ equipping the physicians and clinicians to have competency around SDOH, right? Because
you know, we are introducing a brand new program thanks to the grants that we received from Robert Wood Johnson Foundation and Walmart. So we have clinicians who over the years practice just conventional clinical care. We've started to ask them to integrate behavioral health into their clinical practices. And now we're asking them to integrate the social determinants of health. And the program that we've launched, which is a curbside manner healthcare outside of the hospital, enables us to teach physicians how to inquire of their patients about social determinants. You know, the new physician encounter is very different than the old way of a physician seeing a patient. A physician now should and really has to ask the patient about behavioral health considerations, has to ask the patient about social determinants like housing quality, like food insecurity, like safety in the streets. And once that information is gotten, the prescription for that patient may well be more about programmatic referral for social determinants than it is going to the pharmacy. And because we're now involved with Rutgers in the most intimate way with respect to the medical schools and other professional schools within Rutgers, we feel we have an ability to inform the curriculums that are being taught so that licensed healthcare professionals at whatever specialty will now incorporate in their discussions and diagnosis with patients information about the social determinants of health. I couldn't be more excited about that because one of the things that hasn't changed sufficiently is this encounter between patient and healthcare professional. And until that is changed in order to reflect what's really happening to the patient, we won't have the optimal result. So this is something that is a true commitment of ours, and I'm really gratified to see it happening.
Wow, there's so many questions in the queue, and we're starting to wind down. We probably have about one or two more questions, but everyone is very excited by this discourse this morning, and certainly I am. I want to ask this, I think this question is important to ask. What role can technology play in delivering on the goal of impact in the community? How do we enable companies to leverage their resources using technology to try to make disparities and inequities disappear?
Well, I will tell you that one of the things that we have seen is undoubtedly the surge in the utilization and the use of telemedicine. I think that no one of us who's participating on this session this morning has missed the discussion around the digital divide. Undoubtedly, we could really be quite strategic about ensuring that everyone has equal access, right? And then we would be able to go beyond that to ensuring that they had equitable access. I think that there's a great opportunity to utilize telemedicine in order to address healthcare disparities, but it's also a really important key point that we do not miss the lesson learned from the issue that occurred in the utilization and adaptation of AI. So as artificial intelligence began being utilized, what did we see? What we saw was the fact that the absence of persons of color involved in the creation of much of this technology produced, right, incredible inequity and disparity in its recognition ability. Right. So one of the most elemental things that can actually be done, I believe, is ensuring that our internal teams, as we begin to look at what telemedicine and what technology is going to be implemented and the way in which it is going to be implemented, that we take a look around the table that we've assembled in order to ask how diverse and inclusive are our teams? How have we contributed to the creation of an environment that ushers in belonging? Because simply being at a table but not having a voice that is listened to is not enough, right? So as we are really taking a look at how technology can be utilized and furthered, we need to first make certain that we are recognizing what inequities within our own institutions have contributed to and how we need to take this opportunity to arrest that process or practice in order to change them for more equitable outcomes.
Thank you,
Marcia,
Micheline, for that. Yes.
There is an ongoing issue that we address all the time, and that is too frequently we blame the victim. We blame the very person who's suffering because he or she doesn't have this or doesn't have that or refuses to get that. And I think if you're going to be successful in this area, you have to immediately address that and say, stop. You can't blame the victim. If the victim is truly a victim, now fix what's making that person a victim. But whether it's subtle or more overt, there is unfortunately this tone of blaming the victim and has been around in healthcare for a very long time. And that's something that anyone who endeavors into this area has got to address head on and immediately.
I am so sorry that we're going to have to wind down on this conversation. This has been great. I think we need a part two. All of the chats indicate that everyone is so proud of the work that you all are doing, the book that you've published. And so thank you, Barry. Thank you, Micheline, for your bold leadership. Your book is now part of the pantheon of thought on how do you build campaigns for justice from the boardroom to the pulpit. So I thank you very much. To our guests out there, thank you for joining in. This has been BPR Online, and now back to you, John.
Thank you, Marcia.
Thank you, each of you, Micheline and Barry and Marcia. And Marcia, you were masterful as ever in your moderation. And Barry and Micheline, you have written a book that is an evergreen. And I think people will be reading it for years to come about how to make the world a better place, starting within one's own workplace. So thank you, guys. Our next Business Partners Roundtable will be next month. It's going to be about how real estate development is changing and evolving in the midst of a pandemic. We will send you information about that panel via email soon. And I encourage everybody on this call to join us for what will be a really fun night. And that is Saturday, October 3rd on NJTV and NJTV Online, and it is our first Women at NJPAC Spotlight Gala at home. You can watch it. You don't have to wear a tuxedo or a ball gown. You can watch it in your pajamas if you choose to, and it's going to be terrific. It's a celebration of all things that make NJPAC special, our work in education and community, and it is especially about excellence in performance, especially American song. Brian Stokes Mitchell, the Tony Award winner, is our host, performer, and we'll also have amazing performances by a cast that includes Billy Porter, Joshua Bell, Valerie Simpson, Christine Ebersole, Jared Spector, and Jesse Mueller. This will be a really wonderful hour of television, and it supports NJPAC, so please tune in. I wish you all health and safety and wellness in the days and weeks and months ahead. Thank you all for joining us, and see you soon. Thanks a million.